So welcome to this presentation on messaging and documents, which on purpose we do on the very first day, because this is more or less an entry-level topic for those of you that know the basics of FHIR. And quite often, and I'm a trainer by profession, I'm a trainer with FHIR, so we hear like, oh, FHIR equates REST. FHIR is REST. So this presentation is specifically aimed at those people that may think that, or maybe not, otherwise you wouldn't be here, but that there are other options for exchange. And don't limit yourself in your implementations or your projects to one of those exchange models, because we have multiple, and each have their own characteristics. What are they good at, and what are they not good at? And that, at the end of the day, determines the mixture of exchange models that you're going to use. Okay, so that's basically our learning objective for today, and that's why we're going to look both at messaging as well as documents as two alternate exchange mechanisms. Now, you know that there are 4 exchange mechanisms. Nowadays, people talk about, well, we also have subscriptions and we have a bulk data exchange. Okay, but these are somewhat orthogonal, because you can subscribe to a document, you can subscribe to a message, and you can subscribe to a RESTful resource, right? So it's a bit orthogonal. So basically, we have those 4 exchange mechanisms. And these are very well-known exchange mechanisms. Yes, REST. Certainly 95% plus of all FHIR implementations are based on REST exchanges. But next to that, we can use the FHIR resources to construct documents. And if anything, and I will show you the characteristics of documents in a minute, that's probably, after the RESTful way of exchanging FHIR, the most commonly used exchange model for FHIR resources is documents. For those of you who have worked in interoperability for a while already, the CDA, the clinical document architecture, is in the same category of electronic document specifications. Messengers, that's the oldest, by far the oldest exchange mechanism that we have on the list here. We'll look at the characteristics. But again, those of you that are already aware of HL7 version 2 or EdEffect or X12 or DICOM, all of those are essentially messaging-based standards. Nothing new here. Okay, now I had a poll out for this particular session, and only 10 of you actually answered that, so the rest doesn't get a prize, right? But anyway, it does show us that, yes, basically everybody thinks that they're going to implement FHIR as a RESTful exchange mechanism, but this was multiple options, so you could choose multiple mechanisms. So you see that after REST, people are thinking, yeah, I will probably combine that with FHIR documents as the most common secondary option, and then FHIR messages, less so. And this is exactly what I expected it to be. So maybe, without further ado, let's dive into the details. Now, the special thing about FHIR is that regardless of the exchange paradigm, that's just a fancy word for exchange mechanism, so totally regardless of that paradigm, the content is the same. So I could have a laboratory system that generates a FHIR message. Ooh, new lab results. I will send you a bucket load of FHIR resources that contain the details. And we send it to a FHIR repository, a clinical data repository of sorts, and it basically takes the FHIR resources out of the context of that message and stores them in the repository. Then, using a RESTful app, I can manipulate individually these FHIR resources. You know how that goes, right? And then I can create a FHIR document. And we will see that one of the characteristics of the document is long-term persistence, human readability, and a certain level of wholeness. They create a summary of a particular thing that has happened. So I send my summary information as a FHIR document and exchange that, for example, with other healthcare provider organizations. And this is a typical scenario where you would use documents. But the point of this slide is that we're using the very same resources. The resource here has the same resource structure as the resource here, and in this exchange, and in the message. If I have a FHIR profile for a patient resource, it's here, it's there, it's here, it's there. So it's a fairly seamless exchange if you want. When would you actually use REST? Hey, FHIR doesn't equate REST, but certainly 95% of all exchanges is REST. So what is REST actually good at? Well, low context, okay, small weight, lightweight exchanges, individual FHIR resources, that's essentially what we're talking about. And it's client-driven client-server orchestration. The client is in the driver's seat. So if the client says drop table, then as a server you go, yes, sir. Okay, you have to have authorizations to do that. But the client in principle is in the driver's seat. Post this, delete that, update such and such. Okay. We'll see that the other exchange mechanisms deal with it in a different way. So well suited for mobile PHRs, registries. I'm probably not telling you anything new. But this was just to summarize what REST is very good at. If we switch to documents. So we have our electronic document specification in FHIR for FHIR documents. And what's the characteristic of a document? Human readability and long-term persistence. I want to persist that document as it was at the time of authoring. And maybe I'm going to persist it for 1 day because then it will be read by my colleague, or maybe I'm going to persist it for 50 years and then it will be read by a GP or a genomics researcher, I don't know. So that's why you have the long-term persistence ID. I don't know by whom or in what context this coherent set of information is going to be processed. That's a document. So in terms of FHIR, we're talking about a bundle, a set of FHIR resources to basically contain all of the details of this story, the summary that I'm going to send somewhere else. Now, originally, all of these electronic document standards came out of the tension that exists between the necessity to have a certain level of structured content and the flexibility of text. You know, initially there came a group to HL7 around the year 2000, and it was a bunch of people with clinical backgrounds, and they went like, oh dear HL7 as an organization, we would like to create a standard for documents, and we're going to start with text. You can imagine what HL7's reaction was at the time, the HL7 version 2, fully structured and coded, and they went like, well, we want to do text. Yuck, right? Who wants text? Well, clinicians want text because it's terribly flexible. I can express anything I want. And there's even structure in there. Okay, you may not be able to read this, but here's an acronym that tells me that this is a family history, and here we have a list of medications, 1 time after breakfast, 0 after lunch, and 0 after dinner. Cool, flexible, I can do anything I want. And then the programmers amongst us, or the standardizers, and it's probably most of you in this room, they go like, nah, I want this. Codes are good. I can do workflow, I can do billing, I can do other interesting stuff. I want codes and structures. So I create a user interface and I will force all of my clinicians to do coding and structuring, drop-down lists with codes. Ooh, you're going to be very popular with clinicians if you do that. Okay, but anyway, so if you present this to the clinician, they go like, and if it really needs to be for billing, otherwise I won't get paid, okay, I can probably do this. But where's my text? And they're right. You cannot code and structure anything, everything. There's always exceptions and strange things that you cannot code. Let's be honest. Okay, rhetorical question. What happens if I, as a programmer, were to add a textual entry possibility here? How would the clinician then use this screen? Put everything in the text. Now, the nice thing is, and I use this example wherever I present training courses, which is all around the world, I get the exact same answer by the entire group. So you feel there is an element of tension there between the necessary flexibility that people feel in text versus the need, absolutely there is a need, to have certain information in structure. And that's basically what we see in these electronic document specifications, that they try to create some sort of balance, some sort of mixture between the textual expression and the need to have certain data, not everything maybe, but certain data there in a clinical format. Back to FHIR. How is this modeled in FHIR, these electronic documents? Well, it's a bundle. You are probably expecting that because it's a grouping of multiple FHIR resources. And to be precise, it's a bundle of type document. And the document bundle has, as one of its key resources, this composition resource. Because we are using FHIR resources to compose, if you want, construct a document. That's basically why it's called a composition. So this effectively is the metadata, if you want, for the document. Who wrote it? Why did they write it? What encounter, what patient does it belong to? What's the document type? Is this a discharge letter or a medical summary? What sort of document is this? And then as part of that, we have a structure that's part of this FHIR resource. That's a repeating recursive structure. That's our sections with the human readable text. And in the older electronic document standard, CDA, we had a rule that says there shall be text, because human interoperability was at the forefront in that specification. Now, next to the text, so this is where the text lives, we will have FHIR resources to also express some of the content we have in the text, but now in the form of computable FHIR resources. So if you want, it's a bit of a schizophrenic expression of the clinical data. It's there in text, and it may also be there in structure. Okay. Example, otherwise this will all stay very abstract. Right? So let's assume we have created this set of FHIR resources and references using some RESTful mechanism. If you look at this, it's kind of a high-level overview. We have a patient that has 2 encounters, and on the first encounter they have an ear infection, and penicillin was prescribed, but they turn out to be have an allergy for penicillin, and then we have some other antibiotic. So let's assume we have this set of resources already in, let's say, our CDR in a RESTful way. Now let's create a document, discharge letter, for this second encounter. Now obviously what you're going to do is reuse the FHIR resources that already are present. You're not going to capture that same information again, right? So we're going to reuse the information we already have to compose, if you want, a FHIR document. So this would then be the FHIR document. It's a bundle, that's what the outermost box represents, with the composition resource, which has these section repeating structures in it with the text for chief complaint, physical medications and allergies. Plus, here we are now reusing, we're referencing the computable expressions of that information. So now both the human processor of the document as well as the software processor of the document can actually deal with the clinical content or non-clinical content, because in FHIR the content need not be clinical in nature. Now, to make it even more interesting, the American College of Physicians made this statement a couple of years ago. Okay, structured data should be captured only if all other approaches fail. Kind of an interesting starting point. We want to do text, 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 and only if we really have to, we're going to do structured stuff. Again, it's just to point out that we have this element of tension there. Okay? I don't have an answer for this. We have natural language parsing and we have AI, so we're getting better at this game, but to do this automatically, it's not that easy. But we have both expressions. So let's say we have, this is by far the most common use case, we have some sort of values, okay, that we establish during some sort of workflow. Here it's a simple blood pressure value. And then we're going to turn it into a section in this document, and then we have the computable expression that's already available. Where's my text? So now as a software programmer, you have to create some text. In this case, it could be a table, it could be a bulleted list or something, but here it's just a simple string that says blood pressure 120/80. And it actually shows me here in generated that this narrative, this text was generated, fully derived from the underlying structured content. But we would also have gone the other way. We have patient with onset of asthma in his teens in our database, text field, blob field, I don't know. Then we want to turn that into a section in the document, and we have text. So then the FHIR document spec says, oh, you have text, done. And then you and I go like, no, that's a diagnosis, asthma. I would like to have a structured SNOMED diagnosis code or something for asthma. So that's where the natural language parsing comes in, or some other methodology. And I've sat behind an application on a trade show, and as soon as you type the word asthma, it would put up a nagging, blocking screen and go like, ha ha ha, asthma. Which one of these 27 SNOMED asthmas is this? And you could only continue typing once you had chosen one of them. But these things are smart, because if you already had discharge medication somewhere up in the document, and then you typed asthma, then it would, wait a second, asthma, 27 asthmas, but for that medication, we only prescribe that for 3 kinds of asthma, so we'll put those at the top of the list of the 27. Okay, so you can contextualize already. Or you can have a human coder, which we used to have years ago. They would even go back to the EHR and the paper records to try and find out what the proper billing code mostly is for this particular type of asthma. Anyway, so that's how we can derive, in this case, an observation resource to contain the diagnosis code of asthma. So you can, if you want to do that. Now, the advantage of documents is because they are human readable, there's narrative in there, displaying them is very easy. And this, for example, is why the European Union loves documents. Okay? And you mentioned, like, well, surely all countries can deal with full-blown FHIR computable information. Well, I can tell you, 5 years ago or something, I was doing a training course in an not unnamed Southern European country, and they told me in the break, not during the session, actually, 25% of our GPs have access to a computer. I went like, oh, you mean 75% is still working exclusively on paper? Yes. And there I was doing a fancy training course on all sorts of FHIR stuff. And you go like, ooh. Okay. But as long as you have a browser, you can look at a FHIR document. And if I send this to some fancy country that has lots of infrastructure, like most of the Nordics, for example, let's name the good examples, they will know how to deal with the structured stuff. But there's text, so you can display that. Okay, so that's the highlights on documents. And I will revisit what all of those exchange models are actually good at. Now we have messaging. Messaging is by far the oldest exchange mechanism that I'm going to talk about today. This dates to the late 1950s, the basic principles of messaging. Store and forward architecture. I'm sending something to you and it goes just like email over multiple servers that may actually transform or do routing or some other fancy stuff with the content I'm sending you. Worst case assumption, late 1950s, if I'm sending something to you, I cannot assume that you actually have received it. So next time when I'm going to send you some stuff about a particular patient, I will send you the full demographics again. I will send you their allergies. I will send you a whole gamut of information. It's up to you as the receiver, server-side orchestration, to decide what you're going to process, and even if you're going to process. Okay? Server-side orchestration, and actually quite a lot of processes in healthcare are server-side orchestration, if you really think about it. We're cheating in FHIR, right? We have operations. That's server-side stuff. That's not client-side stuff. But a lot of things are server-side orchestration. And messaging is trigger event-based. Something has happened in our business workflow that causes the necessity to send the data. New patient admitted. Aha. But then I'm the only system in my hospital, and maybe there are 1,000 systems in my hospital, I don't know, but I'm the only system that knows about patient Smith being admitted at this point in time. That puts the business workflow requirement upon me to start broadcasting. So I grab my bullhorn, that's what you do with messaging, and you go like, "Patient Smith has been admitted." And some of you are going to go like, "Yeah, who cares?" And other systems are going to prick up their ears and go like, "Ooh, I need to do something." Right? That's messaging, essentially. So we have these trigger events, these points in the business workflow where we need to do something. Patient admitted, new lab result, new prescription message or something. And that causes a particular set of FHIR resources, depending on what the trigger event is. Because for an admit, you need a different set of FHIR resources than for a prescription. You send it to a receiver, and the receiver sends some form of acknowledgement. I have received, mostly. That goes back to the sender. How you actually do the transport, entirely up to you. You can use REST, web services, smoke signals, for all we care. The standard is silent on that. Although the bandwidth of smoke signals is not terribly high, I can tell you. Anyway, so what we have is a bundle again, but now a message bundle. And this message bundle has as the core resource, FHIR resource, a message header resource with, again, the metadata, sender, receiver, to what patient, etc. And it has, if the trigger event, which is also in here, trigger event, so that could tell me this is a new lab result, then there is a reference here called focus that tells me, well, this is the new lab result. There could be other observations in there, but those are old lab results. But the new lab result is the one that is in the focus, so that's here. And it's a rich set of data because we are allowing the receiver to decide what they're going to process and if they're going to process. So you need to have these trigger events and a definition of what are the associated set of FHIR resources that you need to send. And this is something you will have to detail in an implementation guide. The FHIR spec itself, if you look at this value set, it's actually empty now. So in R4, this value set is empty. It's left to the implementation guides to actually define this. And you could use the old HL7 version 2 trigger events. Some people do that. They create FHIR messages with the exact same trigger events as we had them in the old version 2. But it's up to an implementation guide to decide this. Now with messaging, we have 3 exchange patterns. The message of notification. Something has happened in my system and I'm telling you about it. Smith has been admitted, is an example of that. That's probably 90% of all message exchanges. Then you have what in RESTful we will actually see as the default, go fetch stuff, the query. Okay, in REST, that's the standard way of doing stuff, but that's not so in messaging. In messaging, it's always about notifications. And there are a few things that are about order management. I want you to do something. I want you to start a workflow, a lab order, radiology order, whatever it may be. Okay? So notification is the name of the game. That's the highest percentage here of exchanges. Now, queries in FHIR, how do you do queries in FHIR? With a message. We all know how to do the RESTful queries, but you can actually have those same parameters, put them in a parameters resource, and then put a message wrapper around it, and you can actually send message queries as well. And it will, the response will obviously be queries again. To go back to our example of the patient with the ear infection that had a prescription for 2 different antibiotics, let's now create a message for the second prescription. So we're prescribing erythromycin here, okay, because the patient is has an allergy for penicillin, and yesterday we prescribed penicillin, but now we're prescribing erythromycin. So let's create a message. It's actually a message to the pharmacy to actually inform them that, hey, there is this new prescription. So the message header says, new prescription. The focus points to the new prescription. And we're also sending some other FHIR resources because, hey, rich set of data, and it's up to the receiver to decide what they're going to process. I'm not assuming you've ever heard from me. So it's kind of nice to tell them about what's the reason why I'm prescribing this, diagnosis code, that the patient has an allergy for penicillin. Probably a pharmacy wants to know about that, I guess. Right? It would be nice to include that in the message. So when would you use messaging? Well, if you have behaviors that are much more complex than CRUD, which is essentially what REST supports, asynchronous indirect exchanges, okay? Many resources minimize exchanges. Lesson learned from the English NHS. They have a secure national system for exchange of data in healthcare. And every morning, each and every morning at 8:15, they looked at the transporting and went like, and then after 20 minutes, it went like, zzz. And then the rest of the day, it was relatively quiet. And each time they were going like, what's this? And it was basically the medical secretaries starting on the morning shift, and they were prefetching over the national network all the FHIR resources of all patients who had an appointment that day. Okay? And you know, REST is very chatty. If I want to get your EHR based just on REST primitive exchanges, it's a lot of ping-ponging, right? It's a lot of to and froing. So they replaced that with one message, and one message in return. And then their peak dropped. So sometimes you may even have volumetric reasons for choosing one exchange mechanism over another one. So I also showed you services as the fourth option here. And obviously with services, you can mimic everything you want. You can mimic the behavior of a document with a service. You can mimic the behavior of a message with a service. But there are very few things that you cannot do with, not with REST, not with documents, not with messages. And then there is still a small category left over that you do with services. And that's what we know in FHIR as operations. Dollar everything, dollar merge on patients. That's essentially the services category. So if you want to find out additional details on this, this is where you will find this. So on the front page of your FHIR spec, you will find all the way on the right the exchange mechanisms, REST, documents, messages, services, and not an exchange mechanism, but how do you store this FHIR stuff in a database? Not an exchange mechanism, but they probably couldn't find a better place to actually put this. Anyway, so to summarize, 4 paradigms, REST, documents, message, services. Sometimes you may not have the choice. Even if you think this is best served by documents or messages or REST, if the rest of the world is doing something else, you're going to do what everybody else is doing. The rest of the world uses a fax. It's no use for you to use FHIR. You're going to buy a fax, right? Because that works. So sometimes you may not have that choice. Generally, you can share the data easily across the various paradigms, although going from documents to REST, for example, is not as easy as it sounds, because the philosophies of these exchange mechanisms are really different. So I can point you to some other talks that are related to documents, if you are interested in that. There is actually one on messaging as well, where the Danish national system, they were transforming their current messaging environment to FHIR messages, if you're interested in that. Okay, thank you.
No. Good? Yes. Right. I had one question online on Whova. FHIR documents are used in quite a few projects as a way to, I believe, persist summary information, although messaging as an exchange architecture is pretty old. It's not used that often in the FHIR space. If you're using FHIR messaging, please let me know.
Yeah, and the sender
for
of
which
that,
use case?
The sender of the message is me, because I was asking you whether you had a messaging use case. So.
Oh, that was for everybody.
That was meant for the audience here.
So is anybody using it, I guess?
Is anybody using FHIR messaging? We have Paul. We have a wavy hand here. You're not sure. Well, you're not using it yet then, probably. You can certainly piggyback the documents and send them with messages. You can send documents with REST, so it could be an additional layer on top of that, absolutely. It's not an either-or type of thing. You can combine most of these in one solution, if that's necessary.
For messaging, how would you address the person who send it to? send it to a department of the hospital?
Quite often it's sent to a device. A bit like a domain name in your email address. And then you leave it to the domain to figure out how to get it to the person, the first part of your email address. So that's why you in the metadata, you both have a device that you're physically sending it to, as well as a person or a department that you are for the attention of that person or that department. That's how addressing works, even in version 2.
Any more questions?
It was a very interesting example about NHS and how they resolved their performance problem. One question, you also explained that there are IGs for messaging. Maybe there are some resources, public resources about this use case. And
Sure.
And second question is, if they just needed to bundle that, why they chose messaging instead of doing it in a document bundle? Thank you.
The thing is, this is one of the fundamentals of a document bundle. Okay, imagine the situation that I'm writing as a clinician. It's not a fully automatic process, but I'm going to manually, based on the FHIR resources, used to have, let's say, these extensions to Microsoft Word, and it would more or less import some data, and then you could create a document. Let's assume I'm doing that as a clinician. What I'm doing is I'm assembling a set of clinical information that's relevant. You've broken your leg. So what I'm taking is your data out of your EHR, but I'm stripping all the information out, let's say, about your mental illness, because it's not relevant in the context of your broken leg. So the information that's in there is very contextual in the document. Now I sent it to you, and you go like, oh, that's just a bucket load of FHIR resources. I will throw away the document bundle, and I'll extract all the resources, jam them in my database, and hey presto, I have a copy of their EHR. No, because you took it out of a very specific context. Okay, and that's one of the problems that we have with documents versus some of this other stuff. So documents are never there to drive workflow, for example. A document either exists or doesn't exist. But if I send you a prescription document, it doesn't mean you have to do something. It's just a documentation that there is a prescription. Right? So there are certain things that you can and cannot do with documents. Have their advantages, but also disadvantages. Now, most documents nowadays are fully automatically created. So you have an EHR, you push a button, they assemble a collection of FHIR resources, you junk it into the bundle. There's no human intervention, there's no context at all, really. And then the receiver goes like, well, I will just yank all the FHIR resources out of there. This is certainly true for the CCDA in the US, for example. You just yank your information out there, you throw away the document, who cares? But actually it's a misuse. It's not a document bundle. It's a transaction bundle, what you're using effectively. But the problem is, if your national infrastructure is all about documents, then the only thing, if you have a hammer, then everything, right? Everything looks like a nail. So you have seen some infrastructures where people start to use documents because all you can use is a document. And that's exactly a bit of the purpose of my talk, is to inform you that you may wish to look elsewhere. It's not automatically that your favorite way of exchanging stuff is the best way for all use cases. That's basically the take-home message here. Okay, answers your question. Okay, thanks. Elaborate way, but...
Any more questions?
I checked really quick whether we were using documents or messaging. We're using neither. We're using collections. So we're posting bundles with type collection.
Yeah, collection bundles. And that's actually a much better way. That's the transaction or collection bundle alternative to the messaging. If you don't care about the persistence, if you don't care about the human readability, don't use a document. Use a collection bundle or a transaction bundle. Yeah.
Next question.
So you described messaging kind of in a way like HL7 handles it, right? So it's more like the server has a change and it notifies the listeners about what's happening right now. So the client has to react to it, right?
The fundamentals of FHIR messaging are exactly the same as the fundamentals of HL7 version 2 messaging.
Okay.
There's nothing different there. It's just a new syntax with new resources instead of segments, but it's exact same fundamental thinking. So if you're going to do version 2 message and map them to FHIR messages, that makes it relatively easy because it's the same exchange mechanism.
Is the composition resource only meant to be used within these documents, or does it make sense to use them standalone? Because that's what we are doing.
Yes, you can use them standalone as well. And that's there are specific use cases for actually doing that, which I won't go in here. But yes, composition is a core part of a document, but there are also use cases where it's used separate from this.
Yeah, we basically just have like text snippets from some other database, and we just put it in sections. I don't know. Maybe you should use
and
a
then
questionnaire. I don't know.
No, that doesn't sound like a questionnaire. That sounds more like a composition.
Okay, thank you.
Or a diagnostic report, but that's also a bit of a. If you're not in the diagnostic space, then more of a composition.
What submission methods do you see? Because I can see like a post of the message or like placing on like something like a Kafka queue. Is there other alternatives?
The FHIR specification itself has an operation for this called $process message, but it only says this is the name of the operation and it processes the message, which is basically sweeping everything under the carpet because basically all the logic has to be implemented by the server. But yes, but you can use anything you want. As I showed, smoke signals, HL7 is pretty silent on that.
I think a lot of commercial servers kind of enable async messaging through all those different type of message queues like Kafka, Azure Service Bus, RabbitMQ. So a lot of commercial servers have that functionality built in nowadays.
Go figure, because it's a very old exchange mechanism, so nothing new under the sun. If there's nothing else, then I would say enjoy the rest of DevDays. And remember, there's more to FHIR than just REST.
Thank you, René.
Thank you.